Hello, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Hello, Caribbean. Hello, world. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Page Turners Plus. Today, we're going to be discussing Elizabeth Nunez's novel, Now Lila Knows. To start us off, Francine will give us a short bio and synopsis of the novel.
Hello, everyone. Uh, Now Lila knows, Lila Barnard has left her island home in the Caribbean to join the faculty as a visiting professor at the Mayfield College in a small Vermont town. On her way from the airport, Lila witnesses the fatal shooting of a black man by the police. It turns out that the victim was a professor at Mayfield. The rest of the book takes us through what happens in this community and how all the different characters in this small university town reacted to and were affected by this fatal shooting. Elizabeth Nunez, the writer of the book, is the award winning author of a memoir and 9 novels, 4 of which have been selected as New York Times Editor's Choices. She's the co-founder of the National Black Writers Conference and executive producer of the College University of New York TV series Black Writers in America. Nunez is a distinguished professor at Hunter College, where she teaches courses on fiction writing and Caribbean women writers.
Now, let's start off. I'm going to throw a question out to the panel. Why do you think the writer linked the experiences of the protagonist, the main protagonist, Lila, a college professor in Vermont in the United States, with the experiences, the neocolonial um, experience of the Caribbean?
Thank you for that, Paula. But originally looking at it, I was slightly confused as to why she did that. But then as the novel develops and as you read further into the novel, I think she was trying to draw parallels between the Caribbean situation and maybe the awareness of Lila as a sort of naive character and her experiences in the US. Because in some ways it didn't seem that Lila was very aware of the depravity of the neocolonial situation in the Caribbean. And even through her relationship with Robert, it didn't seem that Nyla, as a university professor, was very aware of the struggles that people in the Caribbean had in a sort of post-colonial slash neocolonial society. Whereas in the United States, although you could say that the colonial situation in the United States ended centuries before Lila arrived, much of the situation in terms of black relations and African American relations in the US didn't change too much. So I think Nunez was trying to show a parallel. Did I fully grasp the parallel? I wouldn't say so, but I see where the effort was made to do it.
But I'm wondering if she wasn't aware. Certainly, she was aware intellectually, because she comes from a privileged background. She didn't suffer the disadvantages of neocolonialism the way somebody who is poor, uneducated would have suffered it. I think she knew intellectually, she understood it. I think it's just emotionally, perhaps. Um, you know, she's upper middle class. She's well educated, so I think it was that kind of disconnect. Um, I
Is it
don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts on
is
that.
it is it that Lila gets a baptism for the Erics and the Kesselwas on the panel to tell you about the born again experience, right? Is it that Lila knows but forgot and got this reawakening? So it's somewhere in her consciousness that yes, there is oppression of black people, there is subjugation of black people, and so on in this near colonial setup. But having graphically witnessed the manifestation of that in the murder that Francine spoke about in the synopsis. Is it that was the jolt or the beginning of the jolt? I'm throwing that out there.
I don't know. I struggled a little bit with this idea that Lila is this, on the one hand, university professor of literature, I believe. Did I imagine that she teaches literature?
Yes, she was a literature teacher.
So she's a teacher of literature from the Caribbean and somehow manages to be naive. And if anybody in the Caribbean has written about neocolonialism, it's literature, right? It's fiction writers. So I struggled a little bit as a believable thing. I do think there's no two ways about it. The opening of this novel is grabbing, compelling, shocking, and powerful. And for any prospective reader, I would highly recommend even just the first hour, the first I listened to it. You can tell the first opening for that reason, because it does grab you. It's certainly a very exciting beginning and shocking. Um, I don't know that and she places it well, right? Before she's even put her luggage down, before she's even arrived at her accommodation, she's confronted with the most brutal realities of American racism. And she's just arrived literally off the boat, or off a plane in this case. But I struggle with the idea that she comes from a position of complete naivety, though. That in that sense, it feels, and I'm going to use it, and I hope people are going to kill me for it, but it does feel a bit dated, right? Like as a British person, like this speaks a lot to my understanding of Windrush narratives of they didn't know it was going to be like this when they got there. But this is 2022, three now. Like no one thinks that like you haven't been overexposed to American stories through media, through TV, through film, through even hip hop music, right? So that naivety I think is misplaced and quite difficult to believe, is what I would say.
I am not sure that it is so misplaced, you know. Upper middle class Caribbean people will, I think often, I don't know, Tony, perhaps because Tony and I live in the Caribbean.
I thought you were
I
calling
think
me upper
I
middle
know
class.
people. I'm sorry. I think I know Lila's. In the fact that she's a literature teacher does make it a little more improbable.
Right.
But but there is, I know Lilas to this day who Caribbean people who live the privilege of being light skinned and middle class and think that is somebody else's problem. That's not our problem. I don't know, Tony. Am I
Yeah, you're
wrong?
largely accurate, Paula. Let me tell you the impression I got throughout the novel. I am more or less sort of vicariously living Elizabeth's narrative, right? So I'm seeing the author being exposed to the very people that you are describing, Paula, who are in this sort of bubble. And there's a lot of naivety in that bubble, partly because they don't want to get outside the bubble because it's softer in there. You know, you don't have to get out and deal with the realities. So you know that as you peep out, you know there are things going on, but let's just contain ourselves. And I think the author was sort of trying to expose those people, you know. She encounters them on a daily basis. She knows them, just like how Paula knows these Lilas. Elizabeth knows these people, and she's trying to do an expose in this novel. Get out your bubble, get out your comfort zone, and understand what it's like to be black, what it's like to be a black immigrant. People are not just making up these things. These are things that happen on a daily basis. So I see where she's coming from, Kessel.
All right, that leads me to another question. Who do you think the audience of this novel is? Who would
Mm,
I, Eric, would you like to give that a try?
I can give that a try, Paula. Thank you. Um, yeah, reading the text, I was thinking about the audience throughout, and definitely since Professor Nunez is based in the United States and has been based in the United States for a long time, it would seem as though the audience would be um, a majority American audience, either African American or black in a general sense, in terms of um, uh, different communities of immigrants who come from the Caribbean and even the continent of Africa. But as I finished it, I really think the target audience was more suited to both a Caribbean audience in general, but also that Caribbean American audience who will have certain types of ways of thinking about the United States, but also thinking about their African American cousins. And I think she's trying to she's poking at that. I think Tony's point before, exposing this type of thinking, this dissonance, or trying to uncloud or the dissonance that runs rampant between the two communities.
I think there's also, I think she also is targeting white middle class Americans. The kinds of details she goes into about the killing of Amadou Diallo, incidents like that. I think even the least in touch black person knows about. But she goes into almost journalistic detail about those atrocities. I think I think she's targeting white people who live in majority white spaces who do not come into contact with black people frequently. I think the fact that Lila, I think, is a character she believes will appeal to people from communities like that, because Lila is, they will see the similarities between Lila and themselves. Um, for example, Lila feeling guilty, or being made to feel guilty. I think that is something a white suburban woman, for example, would be able to identify with. In fact, I think Lila, honestly, I think Lila is was sort of created to for white suburban women to see the similarities between themselves and her. I think Lila is quite a complex character, but I don't want to take over the conversation. I see Kesawa, is there something you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I found it really interesting what you said about Lila being a character that a white suburban middle class woman might in the US might be expected to relate to, and that rings resonant and truthful for me. I guess the other question is, what do we think if of the absence of what feels like African American women? For me, that's something that jumped out. Characters around Lila are Clive, the white lawyer, who's a passionate civil rights advocate. Again, kind of in the 1950s form, but updated. I liked him though. I liked him. It was like his vibe. Um, there's also the fiance, Robert. Then she's got her colleague Terence, who she respects immensely. And for me, it felt like they are the other characters apart from Lila, whose name's in the title, whose story we learn. But there's an absence of any black women in that space, right? Or any women at all. The only other woman I think is what's the word? Her landlady, the old white lady, who's very nice, apparently.
I don't agree with you.
No,
I
I'm
think
happy to fight it out.
Gail, the lady who works in the bursar's office, I think she had a significant role, and certainly the sort of neo villain. What was her name again?
Elaine.
Elaine.
Elaine. Elaine. I think Elaine was a significant character. Um, I agree that there was more interaction between Lila and say Terence, and well, because Clive is the love interest, of course, there would be significant interaction. I'll put it on record that I could have lived without the love story, but but then Keswa says that I am cold and hard. So, Francine, I haven't heard
In
much
this
from
in
you.
this case, I think I don't think living with that love story. That love story was an issue.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not a fan of the love story. Francine, I haven't heard much from you. You want to come in here?
Yes, I do. I kind of tried a couple times earlier. Um, I wanted to talk about the audience. I agree with you, Paula. I was surprised to hear Eric say that it's targeted to a Caribbean American audience. I found not only did she spend a lot of time on the details of the historical killings, but she spent a lot of time explaining things about the Caribbean. And Lila would say, "Oh, this is what we call this on my island, or on my island we do this." And there were long paragraphs describing things on her island, which to me was not targeted to me because it's stuff I think as a Caribbean person, even second or third generation, there are certain things that you wouldn't have to explain to them in the context of the Caribbean. So yeah, that was basically it. I agree with Paula that the audience was Americans, white Americans, maybe Black Americans who don't have any Caribbean knowledge of the Caribbean. But I wouldn't say it was targeted to Caribbean people in general.
I
Paula,
think Erica was right though that Caribbean it's targeted at the Caribbean American community who very often denigrate African Americans.
Ah, okay. From that
Um,
point of view. Hmm.
definitely, I think it was aimed at that community. Tony, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to comment on that love story you're talking about, because I just found it mildly amusing. I don't want to dismiss it in the way you guys are dismissing it, you and Kessel. But but there's Robert, who is what 2,000 miles away, and is this controlling boyfriend. Even with the distance, he's certainly controlling her mind. So I think Professor Nunez wanted to have a juxtaposed option, if you know what I mean. Something that um, Lila, or somebody rather, that Lila um, could maybe find some refuge in. And so there's this person who's physically present and pleasant, civilized, everything that Robert isn't actually. Um, and so maybe that's what was at play there. Was it a deliberate love story? I don't know, but I I felt that was a get back at Robert. Some sort of justice for the reader that that this controlling character 2,000 miles away is going to get harmed. You know.
But
I,
everybody was
okay, but
trying to control Lila, though. Her grandmother was trying
grandmother.
to control Lila. When she gets to the United States, Terrence is trying to control her. Um, what I keep forgetting this woman's name, the neo villain. What's her name again?
Elaine.
Elaine.
Elaine is trying to control Lila. Dr. Campbell is trying to control Lila. In fact, Raul J called Lila naive. I don't know anybody that age who is so pliable in real life. I don't know. Maybe
It may
I
be the
live in a
circles you
shell.
move in, Paula. You, you,
I'm
you're
sorry.
kind of strong. I said it might be the circles you move in because you're a strong character.
No, I agree with Paula. That's one of the biggest problems that I had with the characterization of Lila. And it even goes back to touch a bit on what Kasawa was saying about her naivety in terms of the racial situation in the US. I don't I agree with Kasawa that a professor of Caribbean literature at what is presumably the University of the West Indies should be more aware. And this is some this these are even she was very much aware about Amadou Diallo, and she knew all of that, but yet somehow the other stuff has surprised her. And this is what the book was set in, what, 2017, right? Something like that. Was before
2014.
2014
Yeah,
with
that was Tamir Rice. So,
yeah, right.
mhm.
So I found it really hard to believe that a university professor in 2014 in a world of smartphones where everyone is connected would be that naive. And also the whole thing with, everybody controlling her, like she literally didn't know what to think about anything. I found that quite unbelievable, actually.
Especially for somebody who spent their whole time in thought. Like you're an intellectual. Like thinking is the day job. So it's really odd. Like it's not like you work with your hands all the time and you never have time to think. And so when you think, you're really you
So
talking to other
so
people.
let me
You know what I
ask a
mean? Like you
question.
think for a job, and also you shape minds. Your job is to actually help other people develop critical thinking skills. So how does that even really work,
Mm,
right?
Plus, she wrote this amazing essay about Caliban, right? And
right.
appropriation. So,
Mm. So let
yeah.
me ask a question then. Given the level of consciousness that Lila should have with her academic background and the exposure to all this literature, and she herself is a person whose profession is literature. Um, why would she be with somebody like Robert, who's clearly um, a moron? To be honest.
Don't get me started on Robert because I really do not get me started on Robert.
I
The
think
most
this is a good
unlikable
time to
character in
take.
the book.
Sorry, I think this is a good time to take the break for the reading. You will hear from Elizabeth Nunez herself reading an excerpt from No Lila Knows.
My name is Elizabeth Nunez. I'm going to be reading a short excerpt from my 10th novel, Now Lila Knows. It doesn't need much of an introduction. Lila is from the Caribbean islands, and on her way to teach at this college in Vermont, she witnesses the fatal shooting of one of the Black professors by the police. Here goes. It had only been 2 weeks since Professor Brown was killed, and it seemed as if collectively the citizens of the town of Mayfield had amnesia. As Lila made her way down Main Street to the college, Mayfield appeared to her as the quintessential quiet New England village. One would be hard pressed, she thought grimly, to convince the reader and the stranger that just days before, long, thick trails of blood had been scrubbed clean in front of the restaurant where a relatively young Black man, a professor at Mayfield College, was shot dead by the police while astride a white woman who had OD'd on heroin. But what about the students? Had they forgotten too? Along the paved path towards the cafeteria, which was in the building directly opposite to the academic wing of the college, Lila saw no evidence that their attitudes had changed. As she was making her way to the cafeteria, she saw a banner. It was stretched across the wall of the entrance of the cafeteria, next to the student notice board. Black Lives Matter, it said. The words were written in large black letters on a white sheet. Standing in front of the banner was a group of students, male and female, wearing black sweatshirts and hoods drawn over their heads. When she reached the top step, they stood at attention, one hand raised defiantly in a fist. Black Lives Matter, one of them chanted. Lila smiled nervously. What was she expected to do and to say? Was she to return their salute? She had seen other faculty pass through the door before her. The students had not saluted them. Was she part of us, part of the Black faculty? The students stood in front of her. Black Lives Matter, they had recognized her. They had drawn her into their protest. She and she alone, not the white faculty who had entered the cafeteria just before her. Then she remembered a game she played as a child and the song that went with it. There's a brown girl in a ring, tra la 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 la. There's a brown girl in a ring, tra la 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 la. There's a brown girl in a ring, tra la 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 la. And she's sweet like a sugar and a plum, plum, plum. On her island, she was a brown girl, sweet like a sugar on a plum, plum, plum. She had said to her fiance, Robert, back home, that she was Black. Did that mean she was not a brown girl? That her nationality did not count? That it was more important to be Black than to be a Caribbean woman? Her fiance had called her back later that night. So am I Black too? He asked. In America, you are black if there's African blood in your ancestry, Lila answered. And what if there's more Caucasian blood? Her fiancé asked. Lila was silent. So they will define me then? Is that it, Lila? I must abdicate my right to define myself? Robert said. Lila had no answer to give him.
Welcome back. Now, I'm going to start off this segment of the program with a very controversial question. Is Clive the equivalent of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird? And is he a white savior? Kesawa is finding this very amusing, so I'm going to ask her to answer the question.
Oh, I can't. I'm laughing too much. I love this idea that it's a very very apt analogy. Obviously, Atticus Finch from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, famous 1960s novel about the civil rights movement. Well, not about the civil rights movement, about injustice in 1930s Alabama, I think Montgomery, something like that. I'm sorry, I can't remember exact details. A lawyer who is often thought of as this righteous white man. And Clive certainly does feel very much like he could be a 21st century embodiment of that spirit of Atticus Finch. A difference I think that's key that I think we have to mention is that Clive is also a love interest of a black woman, a Caribbean migrant, a university professor, and that is a new change that was, I think, impossible to imagine in the Gregory Peck film era before 1967's Loving versus Loving, right? You can't see. And which is interesting because Atticus Finch was a widow, right? He could have had a black woman love interest, right? I don't think
In the South?
I mean, I'm just saying theoretically, like he wasn't.
I mean, they all did, but not not publicly.
Exactly, right?
Or even actually they did even publicly, but it wasn't acknowledged. So
what I'm saying is, like, it's a different narrative when Clive Lewis can be considered a feasible love interest. It's not a crazy proposition in this novel. It doesn't feel like, oh, that would never happen. At least it didn't for me. And I'm British. I've never lived in the US, so maybe that's a reach that Eric will be like, that's some nonsense. That would never happen. But I think we've seen more and more kind of US. I mean, in the UK, mixed race couples are not exciting. Like they're very common and very, not interesting in the way that I think in the US there's a different sort of relationship, which is what Terence alludes to a lot, with Ronald's crime being, he dated and loved a white woman. Sorry, that's a long answer. I think it's an interesting question for that.
It's such an interesting question. Give me a second. Such an interesting question that I want to hear from the US resident. Eric, I'd like you to come in here. Please, is Atticus, what's his name?
Clive.
The love interest, whatever his name is. Right. Is he Atticus Finch? Is he a white savior?
That's a good question. Interesting question. I never thought of him as an Atticus Finch type. Reading through it, probably because I haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird since high school. So I didn't think about him in that sense. And did I think about him, or do I think about him as a white savior character? Not so, because I think Clive Lewis, he's more thoughtful than that. At least that's how he comes across to me. He knows he's a white man. He knows his privilege and so forth and so on. And he had this experience that led him in his past life, early life, that led him to do the type of advocacy that he does. Does he slip up? Oh, of course he does. I think he exoticizes and objectifies Lila from the get-go, which made me cringe when I read it, and continued to make me cringe as the two head into actions. I don't know if that was Professor Nunez's point in that. I don't know. I would. That's a great question for her to answer, but I don't see him as an Atticus Finch type. The only thing is that he's a lawyer.
I agree with you. I thought he was an ally, and I thought he was a respectful ally. He knew that he shouldn't be putting himself forward as a leader of the cause. he knew that he was supposed to play a supporting role, and I thought he was respectful. But of course, he made mistakes, but he also was aware of the fact that he would make mistakes. So he was a decent character.
I think
Castaway.
yeah, I just want to add one thing to that is that we can't like we often think of Atticus Finch in the context of To Kill a Mockingbird, but when we think of the lost second novel or the pre-read or pre-sequel, Go Tell a Watchman, we discover that Atticus Finch is very much in line with the worst of the white bigots in the town that they live in the South. He's a member of the White Citizens Council. He's not a white savior by any stretch of the imagination in this sense, and I think he's quite different in that respect. And when you remember that part, there's no way that he's really Clive. I mean, it's a nice evocation of previous versions of characters like this, but I think it is clear that he's a different beast, Clive Lewis.
Yeah, I agree. I agree there as well. Yeah, I think as Paul and Eric mentioned, that Clive is aware of his role in the fight, and he's not trying to overstep the boundaries. I agree there. Yeah.
I think. Sorry, just to come back again on this question of the white savior, I do think there is a white savior character, but I think that's the student.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I was going to say. I was extremely annoyed by him. As good as he was too much. Like, I also found him quite unrealistic. Like in the end, and he had all the right answers for all the situations, and yeah, he was
I
definitely
So
a
was
white
didn't
he?
find
savior character.
I didn't find him unrealistic. Actually, I wouldn't say I found him
Well,
unrealistic. I found him
yeah,
annoying.
maybe I guess unrealistic because people like that actually do exist. I suppose I guess I should say that he was just too much.
Tony
So
wanted to
I was
come
no,
in.
but no. I was just seeing him. Funny enough, when I visualized him, I was visualizing him as an Eminem, the white rapper, who's that's kind of almost thuggish, um, but aligned with a black cause. Um, that's I mean that's an aside, but that's how I was kind of visualizing him, and I don't think that was the intent of Professor Nunez. But I agree that he was. I don't think he was trying to be a white savior. I think he was just trying to be or was a
Who
conscious
is a he? Who is a he?
the
The
student,
student.
the Eminem hoodie character, right? I, I just saw him as being a young, articulate, conscious man of the times. Wanted to, and I'm sure there are lots of white people like that in the United States because you see them on these protest marches and so on, and I don't think they're just doing it for some photo op, but I think they're
I agree that
mm,
there's probably sincerity, but an
sincerity is the word. Yeah.
allies must know their place.
Mm.
Allies must not be trying to lead the fight. And then, in as much as I have said the word fight, is this Lila's fight? Who wants to take that on? What? None of you
And
is brave enough to take it on?
I'm brave enough. I'm
Go
brave enough.
ahead.
Um, yes, it is. It is Lila's fight. Even though some characters in the text want to ostracize her and say that no, this isn't her fight. It's very much her fight. And I mean this is the underlying it's an underlying theme in the text, but it does percolate, it does bubble up toward the end when Lila speaks about I think that when she says she's a black professor, not just a professor, she's a black professor because in that space she is a black professor. She's not simply some literature professor from the Caribbean, even though for some folk that would seem more erotic. I'm sorry, how am I going to say erotic? Exotic, um, exotic, and she's seen differently, and that comes out in the text too. But yeah, if she walks the streets and she realizes when she was chasing down Steve, uh, would she be arrested because there's a black woman chasing down this white young man? So she knows, uh, she knows it's her fight. She's just caught between and betwixt Terrence's sentiments and assertions and Robert's sentiments and assertions as well.
How well do you think this novel
Paula,
addresses?
Paula, before you move on
Yes.
to your next question, I think
Okay.
there is a big point that Professor Nunez is trying to make with that very question: is it Lila's fight, right? And trying to show the character Robert, who clearly was saying that's none of your business. Leave the Americans and let it get on with the business you don't know. And I think the author is making that point where we have these people here in the Caribbean of a certain class and so on that are famous for inaction. But why no action? Because they like to preserve the status quo. They're okay. They're okay in their space, right? And stop this thing about where you think you've got to go and dabble in things that you don't need to dabble in. Don't upset the apple cart. And I think the author's trying to make this point um, as a strong point in the book through that character Robert.
Yes, I definitely that there. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But I think she was also speaking to the Caribbean American community, which even though they live in the United States, they live with all of the realities, still hold on to the illusion of privilege. So I don't think it's just us in the Caribbean she's speaking to, because I know these people. I know these Caribbean American people who still hold on to the illusion of privilege. And they say all the kinds of things that Robert says. And it's not just Caribbean Americans, because I've heard Africans who are first generation, well, immigrant Africans who make similar statements. So I think it's a problem with immigrant blacks who, even if they know the history intellectually, somehow don't manage to know it emotionally.
Is it because that they find themselves in a position of privilege? They've somehow escaped the hardships, the rigors, having to hustle two jobs, two and three jobs, and have not maybe themselves experienced firsthand, get to the back of the bus sort of thing. Is it because they're just putting up a wall and
Is
trying
it
to
also, is it perhaps also just the kind of self-preservation mode, where if we deny our link to the African American struggle as Black people, we get ahead, and it's just pure self-preservation and self-interest, and not, we don't have to intellectualize it more than that. It's, if I identify more as a Caribbean American person who doesn't have these links, then I also escape the prejudices that African Americans face. I'm posing the question. I'm not assuming anything.
Well, if I could jump in here, I mean, not to sort of be an apologetic or anything, but or apologist, but the thing is, I guess for Caribbean people, especially those born after 1940, all they knew were black leaders. In the Caribbean, we don't say, "Oh, he's the first black prime minister." We just say, "Oh, he's our first prime minister." Whereas in the U.S., they had to wait until 2008 to say we have our first African American president. So maybe in some way, Caribbean people sort of misconstrue that to mean that they're somehow immune from the troubles of the world and the racism that they face when they go to the US or the UK, for example. But I think that sort of comfort is misplaced, definitely.
But I'm not sure that all Caribbean immigrants escape that. I mean, I think we had a brief discussion about, different types of immigrants, which is maybe something we want to get into. Some of them do, but some of them are, as Tony said, hustling with the two, three, four jobs and just existing just like regular immigrants and regular Black Americans.
And then there's Lila with a very comfy job.
No, that's one thing that I struggle with in the text is I think there's this some of the characters, and again I don't know what uh Nunez's point was in the overall point, but there was this lack of historical knowledge about the activism of Caribbean Americans in civil rights and more radical racial politics. I mean, obviously, first person that comes to mind is Marcus Garvey, but there's also Hubert Harrison uh, as well, and there are others, and then there are others who are like second generation that we don't even think of as Caribbean Americans. Like,
Malcolm X.
exactly, and
Shirley Chisholm,
he's mentioned in the book. Me from Good
Eric,
Day,
what's his name? The
Holder.
former Solicitor General,
Yeah, Eric Holder.
Holder, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So but let me go back to a question that we spoke about before. Robert, um, Robert and Kenton, because we haven't spoken about Kenton yet. Which of these people um, do you think was a better partner for Lila? Kenton is for the audience because they don't haven't read the novel. Kenton is the ex-boyfriend that Lila was going out with before she got involved with Robert, and she was madly in love with him. Who wants to take that one on? Which of them would have been a better partner for Lila? Tony, you're smiling. Tell me.
Because the answer is very easy. Robert, there's nothing in there, and to me about Robert at all. But I have to admit, Paula, I remember Kenton kind of vaguely, so I'm probably not very qualified to answer. But what I do, the little bit I remember, I think Kenton may not have been seen to be in the class that Lila was in, and therefore that was the friction, that was the area of tension, and so often we see that being part of the dynamic. But I just want to throw it out there for Paula, Francine, and Kessel in particular. I don't want to derail your question, Paula, but a lot of professional women in the Caribbean are hard pressed to find. I'm very careful with my words, so I don't want you all to chew my head off. But they're hard pressed to find men who other people would find acceptable for them. And if they go to the Kentons, they get criticized. Like, where's a big professor like Kessawa? Going out with this fairly ordinary guy. I'm just saying, don't shoot the messenger here. I'm just saying that that is a dynamic, and I think that came out a little bit in the novel.
That is a Vincentian dynamic, Tony.
Vincentian?
It's a
No,
Vincentian.
I
Oh,
don't think so.
no. Let me just clarify. Because I know what Tony's talking about. Tony's talking about a class difference. Kenton, where they were in life when Kenton was going out with Lila, they were equals at that point in terms of socioeconomic position. At that point, they were equals. Kenton comes from a working class background, but he was a middle class professional when they were a couple. Kenton did not suit Lila's grandmother because he was too black. It's as simple as that.
Yes, there was that. I give you that.
Because I know this society and I know what Tony is talking about. What Tony is talking about is when women, upper middle class women, date men of a lower socioeconomic class. That is what Tony is talking about. Isn't it what you're talking about, Tony?
We understood that.
And that's a Vincentian thing.
I don't think it is though. I don't think it's a
No.
Vincentian
No. I will tell you why I'm saying it's a Vincentian thing. Tony started off the question by saying that there is a shortage of men.
And people say that across the Caribbean. That's why it's not a Vincentian thing.
I don't see it.
I think it's a
I don't see it happening across the Caribbean. I think that's a St. Vincent thing.
Definitely, I agree with Keswan too. It's broad. I mean, I experienced it when I lived in Barbados.
Paul is living here too long. You didn't go across the Caribbean.
I don't see it in Jamaica.
I hear about it in St. Lucia. I hear about my cousin in Kitts. I've seen it in Guadeloupe. I've seen it in Martinique. It's a question that comes up again and again that you have these. And I've also heard it argued, and this is where some time, Paula, you feel free to intervene. I've also heard it argued that it's a cause sometimes of domestic violence because women choose men that are not of a socioeconomic background. There's a tension because she's doing well and he isn't. And that creates friction in the couple that can lead to situations of domestic violence. No one's blaming the woman in that case, but I've heard that said as well.
No, I understand that phenomenon because I have seen that, but I don't think there's any. I think the shortage of men of this of your middle class, educated middle class men is a Vincentian thing. I don't see it in Jamaica.
Maybe
But
Jamaica
Maybe
is
then,
the
not in Jamaica, but
Jamaica is
across
the
the Caribbean,
exception.
I've seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
mm.
But
Can
but
I
but
ask
But
a
back to
Paula,
question?
my
back to your
question.
Can I?
question.
Sorry.
Yes,
Yes,
I have
back
a
to
did
my
bring
question.
out
question.
you did bring out something that I forgot. You made the point about the grandmother, Lila's grandmother, finding Kenton not suitable. And I think you hit the nail right on the head simply because he was too black.
But the grandmother
You
said
know?
so in so many words.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
novel suggests
She
that as
said,
well. Like,
Yeah.
that's not a deduction.
I
Can I?
do think that I agree with Tony that of the two, Kenton would have been preferable. But at the same time, I feel like he also would have been trying to control Lila because he wanted her to basically follow his dreams and do what he wanted to do. Like there wasn't really any compromise in terms of what their future would look like. He decided that, he was gonna move to Africa, was it? And that was what she needed to do as well.
and I think
So,
Kenton was also dismissive of her.
right.
He essentially, said basically, you're a bougie girl. You can't live this kind of life. I thought both of them would have been bad choices for Lila. But we have come to the end of the program. We've run
No,
out of
no, no.
time.
We have a minute left, and I have
All
one more
right, go
question
ahead,
to ask.
Kesawa. One last thought.
I would like to ask very quickly how we feel about. I know I mentioned it earlier, the lack of women, but I think the reason why this question about who would be a better partner is because there's a lack of friendship in the story. There's a lack of female friendship and a lack of female characters, and I do think there's a masculine focus. The plight of the black man is raised way too often, and you see a total absence of the question of African American women, but also women more generally. Am I the only person that feels that way? We can do a little heads up, shake a head or something, but am I the only person
Yeah,
that
I
feels?
mean, now that you mention it, it's true. Lila didn't seem like she had any friends, right? She was back home, it was her grandmother and Robert. That was it. But surely, you know, she should have had female friends. She should have been discussing all this stuff with her best friend, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's how
hey, I
how
met this,
women
I met
operate.
I
Yeah.
just met this guy Clive, and like, wow, but
And now I have to intervene to
okay.
stop you because you speak too much, all of you. Um, Thank you very much for joining us. When next you see us, we'll be having a conversation with the author of this novel, Elizabeth Nunez. She's a Trinidadian American writer, and she has some Vincentian connection. I'm sure she'll tell you about that when we see her. Thank you. Bye.